My name is Teresa Clark. I am 67 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and a widow. Most of my life was spent raising a daughter and standing beside my husband, Paul, as we built something together that was more than land, more than wood and nails. We built a ranch that became the heart of our family. For decades, that place was worth more than any number in a bank account. It was worth every memory, every laugh, every tear. 3 weeks ago, I found out that my daughter Rachel and her husband Mark had sold that ranch behind my back. They sold it for $5 million. And then, as if they were doing me a favor, Mark placed an envelope on my kitchen table. Inside was a check for $30,000. He looked me in the eye and said, "Take this, Teresa. Go disappear somewhere else." I want you to picture it. The ranch where Paul and I worked ourselves to the bone. The house where Rachel took her first steps. The soil where we buried our family dog beneath the oak tree. That land, sold without my signature, without my consent. And my worth, according to my own daughter and her husband, reduced to a number scrawled across a check that would barely cover a few months in an assisted living facility. But here is what they did not expect. Instead of crying, instead of begging, instead of raising my voice, I laughed. I laughed so hard that Mark's smug smile faltered. Rachel looked at me like I had lost my mind, and maybe in that moment I had lost something. But not my mind. What I lost was any illusion that my daughter still saw me as her mother, or even as a human being with dignity. Why did I laugh? Because I knew something they did not. Underneath the sprawling oak tree at the edge of the property, something was buried. Something Paul left behind. And when Rachel and Mark discovered what it was, the look on their faces would be priceless. You see, people often mistake silence for weakness. They think if you do not shout, you must not have power. But silence can be sharper than any blade. And laughter, at the right moment, can slice through arrogance like glass. I remember holding the envelope that day. My hands did not shake. My voice did not tremble. I simply slid the check back across the table, sipped from the old blue ceramic cup Paul had given me on our 20th anniversary, and said nothing. My silence unsettled them more than any words could. Mark cleared his throat, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "You should be grateful, Teresa. This is generous. We did this for your own good." Rachel chimed in, her voice carrying that tone of forced sympathy. "Mom, you cannot manage that ranch alone anymore. This money will help you move on. Move on, as if you can move on from 40 years of love, labor, and roots buried deep in the soil. As if you can move on from the place where you laid your husband to rest, not in the ground, but in the memories of every corner, every board he hammered with his hands." I kept laughing, softly now, shaking my head. "You really have no idea," I whispered, mostly to myself. They leaned in, confused, but I did not explain. Some truths are not for everyone to hear at once. Some truths you hold close until the right moment arrives. That night, alone in my kitchen, I held Paul's cup against my chest. The ranch was gone on paper, but in my heart, it was still mine. And under that oak tree, what Paul buried 7 years ago was not just metal and documents. It was justice, waiting in silence. It was proof that the land could never truly belong to anyone else. This is not just a story about betrayal. This is a story about how the people closest to you can underestimate your strength. It is about what happens when a woman who has been silent all her life finally chooses to act. So yes, My daughter and her husband sold my $5 million ranch for $30,000. Yes, they told me to disappear. But they had no idea what was buried there. And when the ground gave up its secret, the look on their faces was worth more than all the money in the world. And this is where my story begins. When I close my eyes, I can still smell the damp earth of that ranch after a summer storm. The scent of rain mixed with hay and wood smoke was the perfume of my life for decades. My husband Paul and I bought the land when we were barely 30. It was nothing but wild grass, crumbling fences, and a shack that looked ready to collapse. People said we were foolish. They said teachers and mechanics had no business owning land that size. But we did not buy it because it was practical. We bought it because we wanted roots. For nearly 40 years, every season was etched into the bones of that ranch. Paul rose with the sun, boots crunching over frosted ground in winter, and came home at dusk with dust in his hair during summer. I baked bread in a small kitchen with cracked tiles, the window overlooking the pasture where Rachel once chased fireflies. It was not glamorous. It was not easy, but it was ours. The oak tree stood on the edge of the property, its branches stretching like arms across the horizon. That tree became our anchor. Paul built a swing for Rachel there when she was 6. I remember the way her laughter carried on the wind as she flew higher and higher, her braids flying out behind her. Paul would stand nearby, ready to catch her if she fell, though she never did. That tree held more than roots. It held our story. I think about the nights Paul and I sat on the porch with our coffee. He always drank from the blue ceramic cup he gave me on our 20th anniversary, while I used a chipped mug from my teaching days. We would watch the stars rise above the barn, sometimes talking about bills or the stubborn roof, sometimes saying nothing at all. Silence was never empty between us. It was comfortable, like an old quilt wrapped around tired shoulders. The ranch was where life unfolded in its rawest form. We buried our dog, Scout, under the oak tree when Rachel was 12. She cried into my lap for hours, and Paul carved Scout's name into the wood. Years later, Rachel brought home her first boyfriend, nervous as a bird, and Paul grilled steaks on the old barbecue while pretending not to glare. Every milestone seemed tied to that land, as if the soil itself remembered. People think of land as value, measured in dollars. 5 million, 30,000. Numbers on paper. But for me, the ranch was not a transaction. It was my husband's calloused hands fixing fences in the rain. It was my daughter's giggles as she ran through sprinklers on hot July afternoons. It was the sound of owls at midnight and the way the sun painted the fields gold each morning. After Paul passed, the ranch became even more sacred. He died suddenly, a heart attack on a quiet Sunday morning. I remember clutching the blue cup, the coffee inside going cold as the paramedics tried to revive him. When they finally shook their heads, I walked outside to the oak tree and pressed my palm to its bark. It was rough, unyielding, but it grounded me. I whispered, "I'll keep it safe, Paul. I promise." And I meant it. Living there alone was not easy. The winters felt harsher without Paul's steady presence, the nights lonelier. But every creak of the floorboards, every familiar crack in the walls, reminded me that I was still standing in the place we built together. The ranch became my companion, my witness, my last link to the man I loved. Rachel visited less often after she married Mark. When she did come, she seemed impatient, scrolling on her phone instead of listening to the birds or admiring the sunset. She would sigh and say, "Mom, this place is too much for you. You need something smaller, easier." I would nod, sipping from Paul's blue cup, and keep my thoughts to myself. I did not need something smaller. I needed to stay where love had taken root. When I learned that Rachel and Mark had sold the ranch, the betrayal cut deeper because of what the land meant. They did not just sell property. They sold the cradle of our lives. They sold the oak tree that held my husband's secrets and my daughter's laughter. They sold every promise Paul and I made to each other while building a life from nothing. That is why the number 5 million meant nothing to me. That is why 30,000 felt like an insult, not a gift. You cannot reduce decades of sweat, sacrifice, and love into a handful of bills. You cannot sell memory. And you cannot erase a promise whispered under an oak tree. As I think back now, I realize Rachel never saw the ranch the way Paul and I did. To her, it was work, isolation, a relic of her childhood she wanted to escape. But to me, it was the opposite. It was proof that two ordinary people could create something extraordinary with nothing but faith and grit. I know this much. Even though the papers say otherwise, the ranch is still mine in every way that matters. Because memory cannot be signed away. Because love cannot be transferred. Because under that oak tree, the truth still waits. And one day, that truth will speak louder than contracts or checks. It was a Tuesday morning when the invasion happened. I call it that because it felt less like a visit and more like an occupation. The sun had just risen, casting a soft light over the ranch, when Mark walked into my kitchen as if he owned the place. He did not knock. He did not call. He simply pushed open the door, carrying himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. I was sitting at the table with the morning paper, my blue ceramic cup warm in my hands. I had circled a crossword clue. 7 letters for untrustworthy. I was about to write treason, but when Mark appeared in the doorway, slick hair shining with too much gel, the answer became clear. Betray. "Morning, Teresa," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. The kind of edge a man uses when he wants to remind you he holds the cards. I did not look up right away. I took another sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch. I have always believed silence unsettles the guilty more than accusations ever could. "What do you want, Mark?" I finally asked, laying down my pen. He smirked, reaching into his suit pocket. With deliberate slowness, he pulled out a white envelope and placed it on the table. The thud was heavier than paper should have been, like he wanted me to feel its weight. "The ranch has been sold," he announced. "Here's your cut." I stared at the envelope but did not touch it. My cut? He leaned back, proud of himself. $30,000, after commissions and expenses, of course. His chest puffed like a rooster strutting through a barnyard. Something inside me shifted, but not the way he expected. Instead of breaking, I laughed. At first, it was a small chuckle, but soon it rolled out of me, full and sharp. Tears sprang to my eyes, not from sadness, but from the absurdity of it all. Mark's confident expression cracked. He frowned. "Something funny?" "Oh, Mark," I said between laughs. "You have no idea what you've just done." Before he could respond, Rachel entered through the back door. She looked polished, her heels clicking against the old wooden floorboards that still bore scratches from Scout's paws decades ago. Her eyes darted to the envelope and then to my face. "Mom, Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I wiped my eyes, steadying myself. Harder? You think you're helping me? Rachel's voice took on that falsely soothing tone she used when she wanted to justify herself. Mom, you can't manage this ranch alone anymore. It's too big, too much work. This way you'll be safe, comfortable. Safe, comfortable. Words that sound kind but cut deeper than any insult. What she meant was controlled, contained, forgotten. You did this without me, I said quietly, without my consent. Rachel glanced at Mark before replying. I have power of attorney. It's legal. That was the moment the air seemed to thin. Power of attorney? I never signed anything. My name was on that deed. My hands had built that life, and now she claimed it was hers to sell. I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside, the check sat like a slap across the face. $30,000, written in neat black ink. $30,000 in exchange for $5 million, in exchange for my history, my promises, my roots. I placed the check back inside and slid it across the table. You'll need this more than I will. Mark bristled. Don't be foolish. This is your chance to start fresh. Start fresh? My voice was calm, but my heart was pounding. You don't start fresh by burning down the foundation of your life. You start fresh by honoring it. Rachel looked frustrated, her patience thinning. Mom, please, don't romanticize this place. It's just land. It's time to let go. Just land. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I let the silence sit between us. I wanted her to hear the echo of her own words bouncing around the kitchen that had once held her birthday parties, her school projects, her laughter. Finally, I stood, taking Paul's blue cup with me to the sink. I rinsed it slowly, the sound of running water filling the room. Then I dried it with the towel hanging by the stove, folded it neatly, and hung it back. I never looked at them again. They waited for me to speak, to argue, to beg. But I had nothing left to say. Silence was my final act of defiance. As they left, Mark's voice followed me down the hallway. You'll thank us one day. But I knew better. Gratitude is not born from betrayal. It grows from love, respect, and trust. And those things had been sold off with the ranch, signed away in ink I never touched. When the door finally shut, I sat back down at the table. The crossword puzzle waited, blank squares staring up at me. 7 letters for untrustworthy. I wrote it this time, betray. And then I underlined it twice. Maggie arrived before the kettle finished singing. She did not knock. She never had to. We met when our girls shared a second-grade classroom. I taught phonics. She filed motions at the county courthouse. Time turned classmates into teenagers and co-workers into retirees. Somehow, she and I stayed the kind of friends who understand the sentences the other never says. She took one look at the white envelope on my table, and the crossword still open to betray. Her mouth pressed into a line. Tell me everything. I poured tea into Paul's blue cup for myself and plain black coffee into her chipped travel mug. Steam rose between us like a thin curtain. I told her about Mark walking in, about Rachel standing behind him, about the check for $30,000 laid on the wood as if it could settle a soul. When I finished, the house felt too quiet, the way it used to feel when the power flickered during winter storms. Maggie set her mug down. Teresa, this is not care. This is a crime. People dress control up in the clothes of love and call it protection. But paperwork does not lie. Power of attorney requires capacity, consent, a signature, and a notary. It is not a feeling or a wish. If you did not sign, they forged. If you signed under pressure, they coerced. Either way, this is wrong. I stared at the blue cup. She is my daughter. She is still your daughter, Maggie said, softer now, and she needs you to be her mother today. Mothering grown children is sometimes the art of saying no while the room burns. If you do not draw a line, you teach her that the line never mattered. The kettle clicked as its heat died. Outside, wind pushed against the old window pane. The ranch hummed with a noise I could feel in my bones. In my mind, Rachel was 6 again, hair in ribbons, sneakers muddy from the creek. She had brought me a daisy and pronounced it the most expensive flower in Montana. I held that memory like a small stone, smooth from too much handling. I cannot drag my own child into court, I said. The words tasted like rust. Maggie did not flinch. You are not dragging her anywhere. You are standing where the law already placed you. She left the law to go around you. There is a difference. She took a folder from her bag and fanned out blank forms the way dealers fan cards. First, we file a temporary restraining order to freeze the sale. Then we record a notice with the county so no deed can transfer until a judge looks at the signatures. We get a forensic document examiner to compare strokes and pressure. We request the notary journal. We pull phone records to see who scheduled what. We keep a chain of custody on every piece of paper. Quiet, methodical, lawful. The plan sounded like a staircase I did not want to climb. Each step necessary, each riser higher than the last. What happens to Rachel? That depends on Rachel, Maggie said. On the truth she tells when the room is no longer friendly. She hesitated. Her eyes softened. Teresa, there is a question you will have to answer before any judge asks it. Are you willing to lose your daughter in order to save the part of her that can come back? I looked at my hands. Age has a way of writing its own story. Small maps of hours and weather. Little rivers of time. What if she never forgives me? Maggie reached across the table and touched the rim of Paul's cup. Forgiveness often walks the same road as consequences. Sometimes it needs time to catch up. Do not confuse delay with absence. Silence gathered. She let it sit, knowing my silence is not retreat. It is inventory. The house creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. The sound slid through the open seam of the kitchen window and lingered like a warning. Maggie stood and moved to the counter, her fingers trailing along the grooves Paul carved when he replaced the boards years ago. My mother stayed with my father because our church told her suffering was a sacrament, she said. When she finally left, she said something I never forgot. Love without boundaries is just fear in a nice dress. Draw the line, Teresa. I felt the sentence settle. My eyes fell to the envelope again. $30,000. A sum that could solve a short month. A price that tried to rename a lifetime. I slid the envelope into the drawer where I keep spare batteries and rubber bands. Objects that stretch until they snap. Maggie lifted her mug. There will be noise. People will say a daughter does not belong in depositions. They will call you cruel for preferring history to family. She tilted her head, measuring me. Let them talk. Quiet justice does not audition for applause. I almost smiled. You always did have a way with cross-examination. That is what happens when you spend 30 years watching judges pretend benches are altars, she said. You learn that the only holy thing in a courtroom is the truth. We stepped onto the porch. The oak tree stood at the edge of the field, its branches strong enough to carry a swing and a secret. Wind lifted the hem of my cardigan. Somewhere beneath that soil, Paul's careful hands had hidden what we might need one day. I wondered if that day had arrived. Maggie followed my gaze. "You are thinking about the roots," she said. "I am thinking about promises," I answered. She squeezed my shoulder. "Then keep one." Back inside, I rinsed the blue cup and set it on the drying rack. Water clung to the glaze like small stars. "All right," I said. "Call the clerk. Tell her Teresa Clark is filing. And Maggie, thank you." "For what?" "For reflecting me back to myself," I said. I had almost forgotten I was still here. When Maggie left that afternoon, I sat in the kitchen alone, the silence stretching like a taut string. The envelope was still in the drawer, heavier in its insult than in its paper weight. I thought I was finished with visitors for the day, but then I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Evelyn stepped out of her car, straight-backed despite her 75 years. She had been my neighbor since Paul and I bought the ranch. Where others doubted we could survive out here, Evelyn was the one who brought over homemade bread and said, "Roots grow stronger in rocky soil." She had been right. She let herself in with the familiarity of someone who had crossed my threshold 1,000 times. "Teresa," she said, setting her purse on the counter, "I heard something troubling at the post office this morning." I poured her sweet tea into a tall glass, the way she liked it. "News travels faster than wildfire in this town," I said. Her eyes met mine. "They say Rachel and that husband of hers sold your ranch. Without you. Is it true?" I nodded. $5 million. They handed me $30,000 as if it were mercy. Evelyn's lips pressed together until they nearly disappeared. "Do you know what I saw last week? I saw Mark at the courthouse, talking to a notary. He was carrying papers, looking smug. I thought nothing of it then. But now, Teresa, I think I may have witnessed something important." I leaned forward, my fingers curling around Paul's blue cup. "Tell me exactly what you saw." She described it slowly, with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime observing details. The notary's name, the date, even the way Mark tapped his pen against the counter as if rehearsing confidence. "It struck me as odd," Evelyn said, "because when I greeted him, he barely looked up. That man thrives on appearances, yet he seemed nervous." Her words sent a shiver through me. "You could testify to this?" "I could," she said firmly. "And I would. This land isn't just yours, Teresa. It's part of this community's backbone. They think they can erase history with ink, but people like me remember." The weight of her loyalty pressed tears against my eyes. "Why would you stand with me in this?" Evelyn reached across the table, her hand steady on mine. "Because I watched you and Paul build this ranch when everyone else laughed. I saw you teach children by day and mend fences by night. You gave Rachel a childhood worth envying. If she's forgotten, someone must remind her." The kitchen seemed to breathe with us. The oak tree outside cast long shadows through the window, stripes of light and dark across the floor. I remembered Paul once saying, "The land keeps its own witnesses." Perhaps Evelyn was one of them. She took a sip of her tea and continued. "You know, when my husband died, my sons tried to sell our orchard. Said it was too much work for me. But I fought. I stood in court with shaking knees, but I told the judge what that land meant. I won, Teresa. Not because I shouted, but because I told the truth, plain and clear. The law, when cornered, still bows to truth." Her story pierced me. She was not just a neighbor. She was a mirror. If she could fight for her orchard, I could fight for my ranch. I whispered, I promised Paul I'd keep it safe. And you will, she said. But promises need action as much as words. Let me be your witness. For the first time since Mark dropped that envelope, I felt a flicker of strength rise inside me. Not anger, not revenge, but something steadier, resolve. We sat there in silence, two old women holding more history between us than any bank account could measure. Finally, Evelyn smiled, small but certain. When the time comes, I'll tell the court what I saw. Let them hear it from someone who cannot be bought. I nodded, the words catching in my throat. Thank you, Evelyn. You've given me more than testimony. You've given me courage. When she left, I stood on the porch and watched her drive away, dust trailing behind her car. The oak tree swayed in the evening breeze, its leaves whispering like witnesses of their own. I thought of Rachel, of Mark, of the check still sitting useless in the drawer. I thought of Evelyn's steady eyes and her vow to stand beside me. And I knew then I was not alone. The next morning, Maggie called and insisted we meet someone. He's the kind of lawyer who listens before he speaks, she told me. And you'll need that. That is how I found myself sitting in a quiet office on Main Street, across from Daniel Brooks. His desk was orderly, not cluttered, though stacks of files lined the shelves behind him. He had the kind of presence that filled a room without raising his voice. His hair was graying at the temples, his suit simple but neat. When he shook my hand, he looked me directly in the eyes, steady and unhurried. Mrs. Clark, he said, gesturing for me to sit. Maggie gave me the outlines of your situation. I'd like to hear it from you. So I told him. I told him about Mark barging into my kitchen, about Rachel standing behind him, about the envelope with $30,000. I told him about the claim of power of attorney and the sale of the ranch. He did not interrupt. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching softly as I spoke. When I finished, the silence lingered. Finally, he asked, Do you remember ever signing anything granting your daughter power of attorney? I shook my head. No, I've signed many things in my life. Report cards, permission slips, mortgage papers, but not that. His eyes narrowed slightly. That's important. If you never signed, then we're dealing with a forgery. Forgery, Mrs. Clark, is not just immoral. It's criminal. The word criminal echoed through me like a church bell. Criminal. It was one thing to feel betrayed as a mother. It was another to face the truth that my daughter and her husband might have committed a crime against me. Daniel leaned forward, folding his hands. The first step is to secure evidence. Do you have any documents related to the sale? Yes. Mark left a packet with the check. Evelyn, my neighbor, also saw him at the courthouse with a notary the week before. She's willing to testify. Daniel nodded approvingly. Good. Eyewitness testimony combined with documentation can be powerful. And if signatures are forged, a handwriting expert can confirm it. But there's more at play here. He tapped his pen against the pad. We must also consider motive. Why would your daughter and son-in-law push this through without your consent? Money, I said simply. $5 million looks like salvation to them. But to me, it's ashes. He studied me for a long moment. Mrs. Clark, this will not be easy. Once we file, the case becomes public. It may strain your relationship with your daughter beyond repair. My hands tightened around Paul's blue cup, which I had carried with me like an anchor. The relationship is already strained. What matters now is honoring what Paul and I built. Daniel's gaze softened. You're stronger than most clients I meet. Many crumble under the idea of testifying against their own children. I am not testifying against her, I said quietly. I am testifying for myself, for Paul, for the truth. Something in my tone seemed to reach him. He set his pen down and nodded. Then here's what we'll do. I'll file for an injunction to freeze the sale. That prevents the deed from transferring until the court reviews it. Next, we'll request discovery, copies of all documents, notary logs, bank transfers. If fraud exists, it will surface. And with Evelyn's testimony, we'll have corroboration. He paused, then added, There's another possibility. If this sale involved a development company, there may be more at stake than just property. Developers often cut corners, sometimes illegally. If your husband left anything behind, records, files, evidence, it could change everything. I thought of the oak tree, of what lay buried beneath its roots. My pulse quickened, but I kept my face calm. Suppose there was something like that, I said carefully. What would it mean? It would mean leverage, Daniel said. Leverage that could protect you and possibly expose something larger. But tread carefully. Secrets are powerful currency, and powerful people do not like being exposed. I nodded slowly, understanding more than he realized. Daniel slid the pad aside. Mrs. Clark, I need you to promise me one thing. Do not confront your daughter or son-in-law directly. Let me handle the legal side. Emotional confrontations can be used against you in court. The law favors the calm, not the loud. I almost smiled at that. Calm, I can manage. He smiled back, faint but genuine. Good. Then we'll move forward. I'll prepare the filings today. Maggie will keep you updated. And Mrs. Clark? Yes? You may feel like the weaker party here, but you're not. You hold more strength than you know. The law is slow, but it bends toward truth if you stand firm. I left his office with the weight of papers in my bag and the echo of his words in my mind. Slow, but bending toward truth. As I walked down Main Street, people nodded politely, unaware of the battle brewing beneath my quiet exterior. They saw only a widow in a cardigan carrying an old cup. They did not see the storm. When I reached my car, I rested my hand on the steering wheel and whispered to myself, I promised Paul I'd keep it safe. And now, with Daniel Brooks on my side, I had taken the first step toward keeping that promise. Grief returns with the weather. It shifts the light in a house and the weight of a cup in your hand. After leaving Daniel's office, I drove home on the back road Paul loved, the one that follows the creek. I parked by the porch and sat there, fingers on the wheel, while a memory unspooled. The morning we buried him. The church smelled of lemon oil and damp wool. People filled the pews, murmuring like a river under ice. I stood beside the casket, holding Paul's blue cup. Rachel arrived late. Her black dress fit like armor, her face a mask. When she hugged me, I felt the chill of unspent tears. Pastor Lane spoke kindly, listing Paul's virtues the way a teacher reads a roll. Steady hands, faithful husband, neighbor who plowed driveways at dawn. I kept my eyes on the cup. The glaze caught stained glass and returned a pale light. When the pastor asked for stories, I wanted to speak 1,000 small truths. How Paul tucked wrenches into his back pocket. How he hummed off key. How he loved the oak tree because it refused to hurry. At the graveside, the wind turned fierce. Dirt looked too sharp to belong to the earth. Rachel took my arm. For a moment, we were a single silhouette against the winter field. She whispered, I will take care of you, Mom. I promise. Her voice trembled, yet certainty rang like a struck bell. I believed her. Believing was easier than learning to live alone. For a while, she kept the promise. She came on Saturdays with groceries. She moved the heavy boxes I could not lift. We repaired the porch screen together. She laughed when the staple gun jammed, and I swore like a ranch hand. I hoarded those afternoons like emergency candles. Then life accelerated. A promotion. A condo. Mark, with his ambitious smile. The Saturdays thinned to months. The months to holidays. The holidays to apologies sent by text. I think of one evening, the year after Paul died. The power failed during a storm. I lit candles and made soup on the gas stove. Rachel called to check on me. I told her I was fine, which was true and not true. She offered to drive over. The road was icy, so I told her to stay. We said goodnight, and I stood by the window, watching wind push snow sideways. The oak bent and held. I learned that night what furniture knows, how to stand through weather. Grief is not theatrical. It is maintenance. It is the daily task of washing the cup, hanging the coat, paying the bill. It is the way you reach for a body that is gone and find air that refuses to be anything else. People call with casseroles. They avoid the word death. I set the dishes to dry and kept going anyway. When Rachel said she would marry Mark, I smiled and pressed an ironed napkin into her hands. He shook mine, his palm dry, his eyes calculating. I told myself not to judge. Rachel deserved joy. At the reception, she danced with me to a song Paul loved. She said, "We will look after you." I folded the sentence and filed it under promise. What I did not see then was the small abrasion that becomes a crack. Mark suggested winterizing the guest room. He suggested selling the old tractor. He suggested hiring a property manager. Each suggestion arrived dressed as concern. Rachel repeated them with careful patience. I learned to listen for the sound of subtraction. The day Paul died, I pressed my palm against the oak's bark and vowed to keep the ranch safe. That vow hardened into bone when I learned Rachel had sold it. Yet inside the pain, there was another ache. Knowing her betrayal did not begin with a pen. It began with small trades made under fluorescent light. Convenience for memory, speed for care, noise for truth. I fold back into the present. The sink is full. I wash the blue cup and set it to dry. Outside, the field glows with late light. I think of Rachel's face at the graveside. A daughter promising. A mother believing. I want to forgive that girl. I do not yet know how to forgive the woman she became. Maybe forgiveness, like spring, follows its own schedule. Maybe justice is the weather that makes room for it. I switch off the kitchen light. In the window's reflection, I see a figure standing straight, older than yesterday, quieter than last year, still here. I whisper to Paul, to the roots, to the cup. I am keeping it safe. The house answers with a soft settling. The promise holds. The packet of papers sat on my dining table like an uninvited guest. Mark had dropped it there the day he handed me the check. At first, I avoided it, sliding it into a drawer as though neglect could erase its existence. But Daniel's words echoed in my head. Secure evidence. So I pulled the packet out, smoothed the creases, and began to read. The first page was a purchase agreement, stamped and signed. I recognized neither the handwriting nor the notary's seal. It bore Rachel's name scrawled in the space where mine should have been. The letters slanted differently from her usual careful script. She had never written her C in Clark like that. Forged, I thought, my stomach tightening. The sale price was listed at $5 million, paid in full by something called Crestwood Development LLC. I had never heard of them. The address was a P.O. box in another county. My mind ticked back to Daniel's warning about developers who cut corners. Further down, I found a line that felt like a wound. Seller acknowledges she is of advanced age and unable to manage property independently. My hands shook as I read the words. To see myself reduced to a frail caricature on legal paper, helpless, incapable, old, was worse than the missing signature. Whoever wrote that never knew me, never knew the woman who fixed fences with Paul, who taught 32nd graders to read, who walked through blizzards to keep promises. The next document was a quitclaim deed, transferring title from Teresa Clark to Crestwood Development. Again, my signature was there in ink I had never touched. I studied the loops, the angle. Whoever forged it had studied samples but missed the weight of my hand. My T always curved slightly upward, a teacher's flourish. On this page, it slumped downward, lifeless. I pressed my palm flat against the table, steadying myself. My heart beat fast, but my mind grew sharper. Maggie was right. This was not just betrayal, it was a crime written in legal jargon. The following pages showed wiring instructions, escrow deposits, the real estate agent's stamp. Sandra Mills of Pine Valley Realty. I had never met her. Yet she had handled the sale of the land where Paul's sweat still stained the barn beams. I imagined her smiling at Mark, congratulating him on a smooth deal. Did she ever wonder why the seller was not present? Did she ever question the shaky signature? Or had she chosen not to look too closely? I took notes, as Daniel had instructed. Dates, names, figures. I slipped each page into a clear plastic sleeve so fingerprints would remain intact. A former teacher cataloging evidence, I thought with a humorless smile. Then I found something else. An addendum. Mark had insisted the property must close quickly, within 10 days, to meet sellers' urgent health needs. That line burned. I had no urgent health needs. The only urgency belonged to them, rushing to sell what was never theirs. My phone buzzed. It was Maggie checking in. I told her what I had found, the forged signature, the false statements. She listened silently, then said, "Teresa, this is stronger than we hoped. Keep those documents sealed. Tomorrow we bring them to Daniel. Evelyn's testimony plus these papers. It builds a wall even greed cannot climb." After we hung up, I sat back, staring at the packet. The house was quiet, except for the tick of the clock. I imagined Rachel sitting beside Mark as he signed those pages, nodding along. Did she hesitate? Did she remember her promise at Paul's graveside? Or did she bury it as easily as ink buries truth? I whispered aloud, "Why, Rachel?" The silence answered, heavy and unbroken. To steady myself, I carried Paul's blue cup to the porch and filled it with cool water. The evening air was sharp. The fields stretched golden toward the horizon. The oak tree stood in its usual silence, branches catching the fading light. I thought of what lay beneath it, evidence Paul had hidden years ago, evidence that might matter now more than ever. I lifted the cup. "You left me tools, Paul," I said softly, "and I'll use them." Back inside, I placed the packet into a box with Evelyn's notes and my own. I labeled it Case File 1 in neat handwriting. Then I slid it under my bed, the way a child hides treasures from prying eyes. The betrayal still burned, but for the first time, I felt direction. The documents that were meant to erase me had become the very proof of their crime. Ink can lie, but it can also confess. And in those pages, Mark and Rachel had confessed more than they realized. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dim light, whispering the words that had become my echo line. I promised to keep it safe. Now, with the evidence sealed, the promise was alive again. Long after midnight, I stood at the porch railing, staring at the silhouette of the oak tree against the moonlit field. The packet of forged documents was locked away under my bed, but another truth rested beneath the soil outside. Paul's secret. The thing he had buried with deliberate care 7 years earlier. I remember the night he told me. He had come in from the barn, dust clinging to his shirt, eyes serious in a way I rarely saw. He poured coffee into the blue ceramic cup, sat across from me, and lowered his voice. "Teresa, there are things I've seen in the county office that don't add up. Illegal permits, bribes disguised as donations, approvals for projects that destroyed wetlands and buried waste. I kept copies, documents, recordings. If I disappear one day, you'll know where they are." I stared at him, heart pounding. "Disappear? Paul? Don't say that." He reached for my hand. "I'm not paranoid, Teresa. I've been threatened already. Developers don't like someone who keeps receipts. If anything happens, promise me you'll keep it safe until the right time." I promised. And 2 weeks later, under the cover of night, we carried a metal case out to the oak tree. Paul had measured the spot with precision, 15 feet northeast of the boulder, 3 feet down. He shoveled while I held the lantern. We lowered the container into the earth, sealed tight against moisture, heavy with the weight of corruption recorded on paper and tape. When he patted the soil flat again, his face was grim but resolved. "The truth will wait," he said. That memory pressed against me now like the night air. With Rachel and Mark's betrayal, with Crestwood development looming, I knew the buried secret was no longer just insurance. It was a weapon, a shield, maybe both. The next morning, I walked out to the tree. The grass was wet with dew, the ground soft beneath my boots. I laid my palm on the bark, feeling the rough grooves under my skin. My breath caught as if Paul himself were beneath my hand. "Is it time?" I whispered. I bent slowly, knees creaking with age, and traced the ground where we had dug. The soil looked no different from the rest of the field, yet I could feel its weight. Beneath lay the evidence Paul had collected: bank statements, recordings of county meetings, photographs of land stripped bare after promises of preservation. Proof that men like James Bradley, the name Paul had spoken in hushed tones, had lined their pockets while tearing through the land. I did not dig that morning. Instead, I stood quietly, letting the tree steady me. I thought of Rachel. If she had known what was beneath her feet, would she still have sold the ranch? Would Mark have pushed so hard if he understood what he was really handing over? Perhaps not. Or perhaps greed blinds more than ignorance ever could. Back inside, I pulled a notebook from the drawer and wrote down everything Paul had told me that night, years ago. His words, his warnings, the details of the burial spot. My memory was sharp, but I wanted a record. If anything happened to me, Maggie or Daniel or Evelyn would know where to look. As I wrote, I felt both fear and clarity. Fear because secrets like this attract danger. Clarity because I realized why Paul had entrusted me with it. I was not the strongest with tools, not the quickest with numbers, but I could carry silence longer than most. I could hold a promise in my chest until the time came to release it. That night, I dreamed of him. We were sitting on the porch again, the the fields golden at dusk. He handed me the blue cup and said, "Teresa, sometimes justice takes longer than a lifetime. That's why we plant it deep, so it can grow after us." I woke with tears on my cheeks and the certainty that the time had arrived. The betrayal by Rachel and Mark was not separate from Paul's secret. It was tangled, woven together. They had sold the ranch to the very kind of company Paul had warned about. Crestwood Development was not just buying land. They were buying silence. Only they did not know silence had been broken years earlier, locked inside a metal box waiting beneath the roots. I walked to the window, watching the oak sway in the night breeze. My reflection in the glass looked older, yes, but also firmer. I was no longer the woman who stood trembling at Paul's funeral, clinging to promises of care from her daughter. I was the woman holding both betrayal and truth in her hands, ready to decide which would speak louder. I whispered the echo line that had carried me through every choice since Paul's death. I promised to keep it safe. And with that, I knew what my next step would be. I never thought I would trespass on my own land, but that is exactly what I did. The night after Daniel filed the injunction, I drove back to the ranch under cover of darkness. The sky was moonless, the kind of black that swallows headlights, but I knew every curve of the gravel road by heart. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, Paul's blue cup in the passenger seat as if it were keeping watch. When I reached the gate, I saw the new lock Mark had installed. It gleamed silver in the beam of my flashlight, arrogant in its assumption that a lock could keep me out of what was mine. I pulled a small crowbar from the trunk, the same one Paul used to pry open stubborn barn doors. The lock gave after a firm twist, snapping open with a sharp crack that echoed in the still night. I slipped inside, my heart pounding, but my breath steady. The ranch looked both familiar and foreign. Developers had wasted no time. Survey stakes dotted the field, their neon ribbons fluttering in the wind. Tire tracks cut through the grass where trucks had already pressed their mark. My chest tightened at the sight. Each stake was a dagger in the soil, each track a scar across memory. I moved quietly, the crunch of my boots softened by the damp earth. The barn loomed ahead, its doors chained shut. I ignored it, heading straight for the oak tree at the edge of the field. Its massive silhouette rose against the dark horizon, steady and unyielding. The tree was still mine, even if paper said otherwise. When I reached it, I laid my hand on the trunk. The bark was rough, grounding me in the present while carrying me back to that night with Paul. The shovel leaned against the fence where I had left it earlier, wrapped in cloth to mute the clatter of metal. I lifted it, pressing the blade into the earth 15 feet northeast of the boulder, just as Paul had measured years ago. The crown resisted at first, roots tangling around the blade. I pushed harder, sweat forming on my forehead despite the cold. Each thrust was a memory. Paul laughing as he mended a fence, Rachel chasing fireflies, Scout barking at shadows. I dug until the shovel struck something solid with a dull thud. I knelt, brushing soil away with my hands until the edge of the metal case appeared. My chest tightened. It was still here. Paul's secret had waited, untouched beneath the oak all these years. I pulled it free, dirt clinging to the lid, and sat back against the trunk. For a long moment, I simply held it, feeling its weight in my lap. I did not open it then. The night was not safe, not yet. Instead, I wrapped it in the cloth and slid it into my canvas bag. I whispered to the roots, "It's time." As I stood, headlights swept across the field. Panic flared. I crouched low, heart hammering. A truck rolled slowly down the path, its beams scanning the land. Crestwood's men, I thought. They were checking their new purchase, unaware the past was slipping from their grasp. I pressed myself against the trunk, the case heavy against my side. The truck idled near the barn, then turned, its lights fading into the distance. I exhaled, slow and measured, the way Paul had taught me when nerves threatened to take over. When the silence returned, I walked back to my car, every step deliberate. The ranch stretched behind me, scarred by survey stakes but still alive. The oak tree stood tall, witness to betrayal and promise alike. I loaded the case into the trunk and slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over softly, a low hum against the quiet night. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The ranch disappeared into darkness, but I carried its truth with me now. Driving back, I felt both sorrow and strength. Sorrow for what had been stolen, strength for what had been preserved. The case was not just evidence. It was Paul's voice reaching across years, reminding me that justice can outlive the hands that plant it. When I finally parked at home, I carried the case inside, setting it gently on the kitchen table. The house seemed to hold its breath. I poured water into the blue cup, lifted it in the dim light, and whispered, "We're not finished, Paul." The metal case sat on my kitchen table through the night like a quiet guest refusing to leave. I kept the lamp on, shadows stretching across the floorboards, as if the house itself leaned closer to listen. My hands hovered above the latches, trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of what opening it might mean. When Paul buried this case, he buried more than paper. He buried parts of our marriage, parts of himself. To unearth it now was to step back into those moments I had tried for years to set down gently, like folded laundry. Still, I knew the time for silence was over. I snapped the first latch, then the second. The hinges creaked, stiff with years underground, and the lid opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside, everything was wrapped carefully in waxed cloth and sealed plastic, Paul's handwriting marking each bundle. He had always been precise, a man who built fences straight and stored tools by size. I pulled out the first folder. Inside were copies of county permits, their dates mismatched with official logs, signatures scrawled with different pens, seals overlapping like a child's attempt at forgery. Paul had highlighted names, developers, inspectors, councilmen. Some of those men had since retired, some had risen higher, but all of them had left their fingerprints. The next bundle held photographs. Wetlands drained, chemical barrels half buried, bulldozers tearing through soil that should have been protected. Paul must have driven miles to capture these images, crouching in shadows, camera shaking in his hands. One photograph showed him reflected in a truck window, hair tousled, jaw set. My throat tightened. He had risked himself for this. Tucked into the bottom was a cassette tape, labeled in Paul's steady script, "Meeting with Bradley, March 3rd. My heart jolted. Bradley. The name he had whispered once in the kitchen, warning me never to trust it. I had no player in the house, but just the sight of the tape was enough to feel Paul's presence across time. His voice was waiting inside, proof sealed in plastic. I closed my eyes, letting memory rise. I saw Paul pacing the kitchen floor that night, blue cup in hand, telling me he had been followed after leaving the courthouse. I remembered the way he reached for me, whispering, "Teresa, the truth will need you one day. I might not be here when it does." Tears slipped down my cheeks before I knew they had started. I touched the folders, the photos, the tape, as if touching him. Each piece was a fragment of his courage, fragments he had trusted me to carry. For hours, I cataloged what I found, writing in my notebook. Permit discrepancies, photographs of waste, tape recordings. Each detail pulled me deeper into Paul's world, the lonely fight he waged while fixing fences and paying bills and raising our daughter. I had been by his side every day, and yet had not known the full extent of his burden. At dawn, light seeped through, the curtains, pale and tentative. I brewed coffee, pouring it into the blue cup, and carried it back to the table. Steam curled upward, fogging the edge of a photograph. I wiped it gently, revealing the image of a stream clogged with sludge. My stomach turned, but my resolve sharpened. The betrayal by Rachel and Mark suddenly looked smaller, not less painful, but smaller against this larger truth. They had not just sold a ranch. They had handed over land poisoned by corruption, land Paul had tried to protect. Their greed had tied them to something far darker than family betrayal. It had tied them to the very men Paul risked everything to expose. Holding the evidence, I realized that fighting for the ranch was no longer only about memory or promise. It was about justice, about finishing what Paul started. Still, unearthed memory cut both ways. Alongside the pride in Paul's courage came regret. Why had I not pressed him harder when he told me half-truths? Why had I let him bury this alone? If I had stood more firmly then, perhaps he would not have carried the weight until it crushed him. I whispered into the quiet, "I'm sorry, Paul." But almost as quickly, I heard his echo in my mind. The same words he had spoken when he buried the case. The truth will wait. And now it no longer waited. I closed the case carefully, relatching the metal with firm hands. It was no longer just Paul's secret. It was ours, his legacy, and my duty. I slid the notebook beside it, my handwriting sharp and steady. For the first time since Mark laid that check on my table, I felt like I was not reacting to betrayal, but standing in purpose. Betrayal was loud, but truth was louder when carried patiently. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the oak fields visible from my window. I lifted the blue cup, took a sip of coffee, and let the warmth settle me. "I promised to keep it safe," I whispered again. Now, at last, I understood what keeping it safe truly meant. Dawn had not fully broken when I set the metal case on the table and turned the lamp brighter. The lid sat ajar. I washed my hands, dried them on a linen towel, and touched the clasps. I needed to see everything. Not only the headline of Paul's courage, but the footnotes he left for me. Inside, the order steadied me. Each bundle was wrapped in waxed cloth and labeled in his square handwriting. Dates, witnesses. A small envelope wrote on top, addressed in the old way he used for birthday cards. "Teresa, all my love." I slid a butter knife under the flap and lifted a single page. His words ran in blue ink. "If you are reading this, it means the time arrived. Do not be afraid of the noise truth makes. Use the law. Keep a record. Trust your own eyes. This case holds what I could not hand to a boss I no longer trusted. I believe you will finish it with the steadiness you always carried. Remember the oak. Roots hold even when branches break." I pressed the paper to my chest, then set it beside the blue cup. Beneath it lay a cloth roll. I untied the knot and found the original deed Paul and I signed when we bought the ranch, along with a later recording he filed. A homestead declaration and a life estate acknowledgement, both notarized. My name stood where it mattered. No conveyance could be valid without my voluntary signature. Next came a manila folder labeled Title Irregularities. Inside were copies of chain of title pages with margins full of Paul's annotations, arrows at a missing page number, a note that read, "Not in index on date filed. Possible substitution." He had stapled a clerk's receipt to one sheet and circled a timestamp that contradicted another. Paper argued with paper. The contradiction was a confession. At the bottom of the folder sat a small cotton pouch. I opened it and found Paul's wedding band, dull from years in the dark. He must have slipped it off when his knuckles swelled from work and tucked it here so it would not be lost. I held the ring between finger and thumb. The weight was slight, the gravity immense. I set it beside the cup and felt the room steady. There were photographs I had missed the night before. Close shots of barrels near a creek bed, a ledger with columns of payments, a councilman shaking hands with a developer beneath a banner that promised stewardship. Paul's notes named the developer, Crestwood's parent company, routed through a shell. He traced money through a charity that sponsored scholarships. The entries lined up with zoning approvals the week after. It was not speculation. It was accounting that told a moral story. A smaller case nested under the folders. Inside sat a handheld recorder wrapped in plastic and 2 microcassettes labeled with dates. I found fresh batteries and fed them in. When I pressed play, static filled the room, then voices. One spoke with the confident boredom of a man used to shortcuts. "We fast-track friends. Your application will not see daylight. The board votes Thursday." Another voice answered, lower, cautious. An amount was named. The recorder clicked as Paul ended the file. I wrote a list in my notebook, each item numbered, each page dated and initialed. Daniel's chain of custody lecture from yesterday echoed in my head. I slid everything into clear sleeves and returned them to the case in the same order. "The law may be slow," I said aloud, "but it respects careful hands." I packed a second bag for the morning. Deed copies, the recorder, a selection of photographs, Paul's envelope. The ring I slipped onto a chain and fastened at my neck. Metal cooled my skin and warmed my resolve. I rinsed the blue cup, set it to dry, and stood by the window. The oak was a dark silhouette against a paler sky, a witness that did not need to speak to be believed. Before leaving the kitchen, I took one last inventory. Rage wanted speeches. Sorrow wanted to call Rachel. I chose neither. I chose the work. I would bring these materials to Daniel. I would let law, not anger, be the voice of our house. The scandal behind the sale would show itself when the right light hit the page. I closed the case gently and slid it into the canvas bag. The house sighed as wood settled. I whispered toward the oak and toward the ring now resting against my collarbone. I am keeping it safe. I am finishing what you began. Then I turned off the lamp and watched the room fall now into a soft, honest dark. I had rehearsed the conversation with Rachel in my head 100 times, but when I finally stood at her front door, every line dissolved. The morning was bright, the kind of crisp autumn air that carries the smell of leaves burning somewhere in the distance. My canvas bag, with Paul's documents tucked safely inside, hung from my shoulder. I knocked once, then again. The door swung open, and Rachel appeared. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore the silk robe Mark had bought her for their anniversary. For a moment, I saw not the woman she had become, but the child I once tucked into bed. My voice trembled, but I steadied it. "Rachel, we need to talk." Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the driveway as though expecting an audience. "Mom, this isn't a good time." "It never is when truth knocks," I said quietly. "Let me in." She hesitated, then stepped aside. The foyer smelled of expensive candles, lavender and cedarwood masking something sour underneath. I walked into the living room, where papers were spread across the coffee table. Contracts, brochures, glossy renderings of luxury homes stamped with Crestwood's logo. I set my bag down gently and looked at her. "You and Mark sold the ranch for $30,000. Her arms crossed, chin lifted. "We did what was best. That place was a burden you couldn't handle anymore." "A burden?" My voice stayed calm, but my chest burned. "Rachel, that ranch was the backbone of our family. Your father and I built it, acre by acre, year after year." She rolled her eyes. "You're romanticizing dirt. Mark and I are thinking of the future. Developments like Crestwood bring jobs, schools, growth." I took a deep breath. Silence stretched between us until she shifted uncomfortably. Then I said, "You didn't tell me you had power of attorney." Her face stiffened. "Mark said it was the only way to protect you. After your dizzy spell—" "I never signed those papers, Rachel. And I never had a dizzy spell. You lied." Her jaw worked as she searched for words. Finally, she whispered, "We thought you'd get in the way. You cling to that land like it's holy. But it's just property, Mom. Money can do more for us now than sentiment ever will. Money." I stepped closer, my voice still low, steady. "They paid $3.2 million for that land, and you handed me $30,000. Do you understand what you've done?" Her eyes widened. 3.2? Mark told me. She stopped, catching herself. The silence was heavier than shouting could ever be. I let her words hang in the air, let the betrayal sink in for both of us. I opened my bag and drew out Paul's envelope. I set it on the table beside the Crestwood brochures. "Your father knew this day might come. He left more than land behind. He left proof." Rachel's hands shook as she reached for the envelope but didn't open it. Proof of what? Fraud. Corruption. The kind of evidence that ruins careers and companies. He buried it to protect us. And now, because of you and Mark, it's at risk of being lost. Her face paled. "You're lying." I didn't answer. Instead, I lifted Paul's wedding band from the chain around my neck and placed it beside the envelope. The sight of it broke something in her. Her shoulders slumped, and her robe sagged like it was too heavy. "Mom." Her voice cracked. "We just wanted a better life." "Better than what?" I asked. "Better than the life your father and I gave you? The life built with sweat and sacrifice?" Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time in years, I saw the little girl who once clung to my hand at the county fair, afraid of the noise but trusting me to guide her. "You've been so quiet," she whispered. "I thought you didn't care." "I cared enough to stay silent until silence no longer protected you." We stood there, the air between us charged with all the words we had never said. I wanted to reach out, to cradle her face as I once did, but I didn't move. Love does not erase accountability. Finally, I said, "Rachel, you can still choose. Stand with me or stand with them. But understand, truth has already woken, and it will not go back to sleep." She sank into the couch, head in her hands. I picked up Paul's envelope and the ring, returning them to my bag. Her silence followed me to the door, heavier than any plea could have been. As I stepped outside, I whispered a line Paul often used when students failed his class, but still had another chance. "Grace waits, but not forever. The letter arrived without a return address, slid under my door in the early hours of morning. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, and my name, Teresa Collins, typed in neat block letters across the front. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, knowing instinctively it would not be a neighbor's note or a church bulletin. Inside was a single page and a cashier's check for $2 million. The page bore Crestwood's letterhead. The words were simple. We are prepared to resolve all disputes amicably. In exchange for your silence and cooperation, the enclosed amount will be wired to your account. No further legal action will be necessary. Consider this a gesture of respect for your years on the ranch. I sat at the kitchen table with the check in my hands, Paul's blue cup resting beside me. $2 million. Enough to pay off Rachel's debts, enough to set aside for grandchildren who might someday need college tuition, enough to end the gnawing worry of growing old alone. But as I stared at the numbers, I felt more emptiness than relief. Money could build walls, but it could not rebuild trust. It could buy silence, but it could never buy back the years Paul and I poured into that soil. I poured coffee into the blue cup and held it steady. The steam curled upward, blurring the edges of the check until it looked less like salvation and more like temptation. Daniel's voice echoed in my mind from our meeting days earlier. Teresa, once you accept their terms, you lose your ground. Not just legally, morally. He had warned me Crestwood would try something like this, and still the weight of the check pressed hard against my chest. I folded the paper, slid it back into the envelope, and set it aside. But it did not leave my thoughts. For hours, I paced the kitchen, listening to the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the small sounds of a house that had outlived its family. What if I took it? What if I said yes, not for myself, but for Rachel? She had sat on her couch in tears, robe slipping from her shoulders, whispering about wanting a better life. $2 million could give her that chance. Perhaps forgiveness could be purchased if delivered in stacks of bills. I sat down again, pressing my forehead to the cool table. I thought of Paul's handwriting, the letter he left me. Use the law. Keep a record. Trust your own eyes. He had buried the evidence not to trade it for cash, but to anchor truth when storms came. Would I betray him now? At the very moment truth pressed against the door, waiting to be let in? The moral conflict was sharp. One path promised comfort, but carried the rot of compromise. The other promised struggle, but held the dignity of integrity. I closed my eyes, imagining Rachel's children, my grandchildren, standing at the oak tree. What story would I leave them? That their grandmother had accepted hush money? Or that she had stood firm, even when standing meant standing alone? I took the check and held it over the flame of the gas stove. The fire caught quickly, curling the corners, turning numbers into ash. The smell of burning paper filled the kitchen. I watched until it disintegrated completely, until no trace of temptation remained. My hands trembled, but my heart settled. I knew what side of the line I stood on. An hour later, I called Daniel. They made their offer, I said. And? His voice was cautious. They offered silence for $2 million. I answered with fire. There was a pause, then a low exhale. You chose well. It will not make things easier, but it will make them honest. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet, listening to the faint tick of the clock on the wall. My life had always been measured in such small, ordinary sounds. Cows lowing in the distance, Paul humming as he fixed a fence, Rachel's laughter echoing through the fields. Ordinary sounds that now felt like sacred promises. The offer from Crestwood had forced me to look into the mirror of my own soul. I had seen the lines of age, the wear of grief, but also the strength that came from choosing truth over convenience. I reached for Paul's ring at my neck, pressed it against my lips, and whispered, "I am still with you." I did not bend. When night fell, I returned to the oak tree in my thoughts, the place where roots run deep and storms cannot reach. The moral conflict had nearly broken me, but out of it came clarity. The ranch was never just land. It was our story, our legacy, our vow to stand steady when others faltered. And I intended to keep that vow, whatever storm Crestwood sent next. The morning I decided to file the lawsuit was colder than usual, though the calendar said spring had already arrived. I woke before dawn, the silence of the house pressing around me like a question I had to answer. The blue cup sat on the counter, and I filled it with hot coffee, letting the steam warm my face. Paul's ring rested against my chest. I touched it and whispered, "It's time." I had already gathered the documents. The deed with my name, the questionable power of attorney papers with forged signatures, the photographs Paul had taken, and the recordings that captured voices sealing corrupt deals in hushed tones. Each piece was an arrow in a quiver I hoped would strike true. Daniel met me outside the courthouse. He carried his own case stuffed with copies, legal forms, and the steadiness of a man who had seen long fights before. "Are you ready?" he asked, scanning my face as if he could measure my resolve. "I've been ready for years," I said. We walked up the stone steps, our footsteps echoing against the grand columns. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, like every school hallway I'd ever taught in. Inside, clerks bustled between counters, their voices low, their faces tired from routine. To them, this was another day. To me, it was the day my silence ended. At the filing desk, Daniel set the documents down, his voice calm as he explained the claim. Elder fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud, fraudulent transfer of property, violation of fiduciary duty. Each word was sharp, deliberate, like hammer blows driving nails into wood. I stood beside him, listening, my heart steady. The clerk, a woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Collins, do you swear this is your true and voluntary action?" I met her gaze. "I do. I swear it with everything I have left." She stamped the papers, the sound echoing louder than it should have. With that thud, the case was born. A lawsuit filed not just against Crestwood, but against my own daughter and son-in-law. The words on paper carried the weight of family, betrayal, and justice bound together. When we left the counter, Daniel paused in the corridor. "Teresa, I need you to know this won't be easy. They'll fight. They'll threaten. They may even smear your name. I've already lived through betrayal worse than that," I said softly. "I can live through this." As we stepped outside, the sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the courthouse steps with sharp light. I felt it on my face, a reminder that truth does not cower in shadow forever. The drive home was quiet. My thoughts circled Rachel. Filing against her was the deepest wound of all. I remembered holding her as a newborn, whispering lullabies, promising her a world that was safe and good. I wondered what she would think when she saw the papers served, when she realized her mother had chosen law over loyalty. Was it betrayal? Or was it the only form of love left? to stop her before she sank deeper into corruption's quicksand. The moral weight sat heavy, but I knew the answer. Silence would have been the true betrayal. Back in my kitchen, I placed the stamped copy of the lawsuit on the table beside Paul's letter. The documents looked unremarkable, ink on paper, lines in neat margins, but I knew their power. They were the rope that could pull Rachel back from ruin, even if she hated me for holding it. That evening, the phone rang. Daniel's voice carried calm urgency. "It's official. The court accepted the filing. Crestwood, Mark, and Rachel have been served notice. They'll scramble, but we're first in the fight now. You set the stage." I thanked him, then sat in the quiet after he hung up. The house felt different, as though the walls had taken a deep breath. Filing the lawsuit had not restored the ranch, nor erased betrayal, but it shifted the balance. For the first time in years, I wasn't only reacting. I had taken action. I poured another cup of coffee and carried it to the porch. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. I thought of Paul, of the years we built the ranch with our hands, of the oak tree that had held his secret for me. "I did it," I whispered. "I chose law, not silence, and I'll keep choosing it until the truth stands." The lawsuit was not an ending. It was a beginning of a battle fought not with fists or fury, but with paper, patience, and a determination that even betrayal could not erase. It was only a matter of days after the lawsuit was filed that the cracks began to show, and Mark's polished exterior started to peel away. I had always known he wore confidence like a suit, pressed, expensive, and empty once removed. But watching the unraveling of his world was like watching a storm snap a tree you always suspected was hollow inside. Daniel called me first with the news. "Teresa, Crestwood has turned on Mark. They're claiming he misrepresented the title and failed to disclose potential encumbrances. In short, they're throwing him under the bus." I sat at my kitchen table, the lawsuit papers spread before me, and let his words sink in. Mark, who strutted through my home as though he owned it, now stood in the spotlight as the weakest link. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means his allies are abandoning him. Crestwood will argue he acted alone, forging signatures, pushing the sale. They'll claim ignorance. If that sticks, he'll carry the weight himself." I pictured Mark sitting in his office, silk tie loosened, phone buzzing with unanswered calls, his empire of confidence collapsing like sandcastles under a tide. That evening, Rachel called. Her voice was strained, brittle. "Mom, Mark's in trouble. They're saying he falsified everything. He swears he did it for us, for our future. Please, you have to understand." I listened, my silence heavy. When I finally spoke, my words were measured. "Rachel, understanding does not erase consequences. He chose lies over truth. That choice is catching up with him." She sobbed quietly, and I closed my eyes. It hurt, even now, to hear her in pain. But I could not lift her out of this storm. She had stepped into it beside him. The next morning, headlines carried the story. Local developer faces fraud allegations in ranch sale. Mark's photograph stared back at me from the front page, his expression caught mid-blink, as if even the camera had captured his unraveling. Reporters listed his debts, lawsuits from other failed projects, whispers of bribes left uninvestigated. Suddenly, Mark was not just a man in trouble, he was a man exposed. Neighbors stopped me at the grocery store, their voices hushed but curious. "Teresa, did you see the paper? Is it true? Did your son-in-law really forge your name?" I answered, only with a quiet nod, unwilling to feed gossip, but unwilling to protect him anymore. Daniel met me later that week with updates. Mark's been subpoenaed. They've frozen his accounts. He's desperate. Men like him, Teresa, they only know how to run fast when the ground beneath them is steady. Right now, he's sinking. I thought back to the first time Mark shook Paul's hand, years ago, when Rachel brought him home for dinner. He was polished then, too, with a salesman's smile and easy laughter. Paul had leaned close to me after they left that night and whispered, "He sells himself too hard. Be careful." Paul's instinct had been right, as always. Mark's downfall was swift. Within weeks, he was removed from Crestwood's projects. His name was dragged across newspapers, his reputation shredded by the same investors who once praised his ambition. He stood accused of elder fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. One afternoon, Rachel came to my house. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "They've arrested him, Mom. Mark. They came this morning. He's in county jail waiting for arraignment." I let her in, poured her tea, and sat across from her. She looked so small in the kitchen she had grown up in. Her robe was gone, replaced by a plain sweater, but the weight she carried made her seem older than her years. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "You tell the truth," I answered softly. "It's the only thing left." She looked at me, tears sliding down her cheeks. "He said he did it for me, for us. But now, it's like he's a stranger." I reached for her hand, hesitant but firm. Sometimes love blinds us to what we already know. You wanted to believe in him, but belief does not erase reality. The tea cooled between us, and for the first time in months, Rachel did not argue. She simply sat, quiet, holding my hand like she used to as a child when the world felt too big. Later, alone, I walked to the porch and looked toward the horizon, where the ranch stretched, unseen, but alive in my memory. Mark's fall had been loud, messy, public. Mine had been quiet, hidden, dismissed. Yet I had stood back up. He might never. The truth was heavy, but it did not crush me. Watching his downfall reminded me that strength is not in never falling. It is in rising when you do. And I had chosen to rise. I sipped from Paul's blue cup, the ring cool against my skin, and whispered into the evening air, "Justice has its own timing, Paul." Today, it was Mark's turn to face it. It was a gray afternoon when Rachel appeared at my doorstep again. This time, she did not bother with makeup or the armor of polished clothes. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. She looked like a woman unraveling, not the daughter who once believed she could orchestrate the world to her liking. "Mom," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please, I didn't know it would get this bad." I let her inside. She dropped her purse on the floor as though it weighed 100 pounds. She collapsed into the same kitchen chair where she had eaten her breakfasts as a child, cereal bowls and giggles still echoing in my memory. "What happened, Rachel?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. She rubbed her temples. "Mark's lawyers quit. They said there's nothing they can do. He's talking about a plea deal. And Crestwood, they've cut us off. We're broke, Mom. The accounts are frozen. I can't even pay the mortgage." Her words poured out like floodwater. Desperation clung to every syllable. "Rachel," I said gently, "this is the consequence of choices you made." Her head snapped up, eyes blazing with the remnants of defiance. "Don't you think I know that? Don't you think I've been living with that every day since this started?" But what am I supposed to do now? I have nothing. I folded my hands around Paul's ring, grounding myself in the steadiness it gave me. You still have the truth, Rachel. It's the only way forward. She laughed bitterly. The truth. The truth is that I betrayed you. I betrayed Dad's memory. I let Mark talk me into something I knew was wrong because I wanted. Her voice cracked and tears slid down her face. Because I wanted to be seen, to be more than the girl who grew up in a ranch house with hand-me-downs. I thought money would fix the emptiness. Her confession pierced me deeper than anger ever could. For the first time, I saw her not just as the woman who had betrayed me, but as the child who had once stood in front of a mirror, asking if she was enough. You were always enough, I said softly, but you didn't believe it. And so you traded what could never be replaced for what would never satisfy. She buried her face in her hands. I can't undo it. I can't make it right. All I can do is beg you to help me. Please, Mom. Please don't let me fall apart. Her words hung heavy in the air. A mother's instinct screamed to comfort, to protect, to gather her into my arms. But another voice, the voice of justice, of Paul's careful warnings, reminded me that comfort without accountability is only enabling. I will not let you be destroyed, I said slowly. But I cannot erase the consequences of what you and Mark chose. You must stand in the light, Rachel. You must testify. You must speak the truth, even if it shames you. She looked up at me with fear. If I testify, I'll lose everything. My reputation, my home, my friends. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Rachel, you've already lost those things. What you still have is a chance to begin again, clean, to live without secrets pressing against your chest. Her shoulders shook as she wept silently. The sound was not dramatic. It was hollow, stripped of performance. For the first time in years, her tears felt real. Do you hate me? She asked finally, her voice a whisper. I closed my eyes. Images of her childhood spun through my mind. Her first steps across the barn floor, the way she clung to Paul's hand when thunder rattled the windows, the shy smile when she brought home her first report card. Love braided through every memory, unbroken even by betrayal. No, I said firmly. I don't hate you. I grieve what you did. But hatred has no place here. I will walk beside you if you choose truth. I will not walk beside you if you cling to lies. She nodded, her tears dripping onto the table. For a moment, the silence between us felt like a truce. Later that evening, after she had gone, I stood on the porch and looked toward the horizon. The ranch lay hidden by distance, but I could almost see the oak tree, tall and steady. Rachel's desperation weighed on me, but so did a flicker of hope. Perhaps in her breaking, there was room for rebuilding. I whispered into the cool air, Paul, our daughter has fallen low, but maybe, just maybe, she is finally ready to rise. The courthouse smelled of polish and nerves the morning the judge delivered the decision. I had sat in classrooms, auditoriums, and funeral chapels, but nothing compared to the hush of that courtroom. Every word carried weight. Every silence was heavy. My hands rested on my lap, Paul's ring cool against my skin, the blue cup left at home like a talisman waiting on the table. Daniel sat beside me, his posture calm but alert. Rachel sat a row back, her face pale, her eyes downcast. Mark was nowhere to be seen. He was already in custody, his downfall sealed by his own arrogance. The only thing left was the ranch, the land Paul and I had built, the land Crestwood tried to seize with forged signatures and lies. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and glasses that caught the light, shuffled papers before speaking. In the matter of Collins versus Crestwood Development and Associates, he began, his voice steady. This court has reviewed the evidence, including the original deed, the questionable power of attorney, and the supporting documentation provided by the plaintiff. My heart pounded, each beat a hammer on the inside of my ribs. I glanced at Rachel. She wouldn't meet my eyes, but her hands clenched the edge of the bench like a woman bracing for impact. The evidence, the judge continued, clearly demonstrates forgery of the plaintiff's signature on the power of attorney documents. Testimony has further established the fraudulent nature of the sale of the Collins Ranch. Therefore, the transfer of ownership to Crestwood Development is declared null and void. The property shall revert to its rightful owner, Mrs. Teresa Collins. The words landed like a bell toll. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then air rushed back into my lungs, sharp and sweet. The ranch was mine again, not because of sentiment, but because truth had been restored in ink and law. I looked at Rachel. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. It wasn't victory she felt, but release. For her, this was not only about land, but about the weight of lies crumbling around her. The judge's voice cut through again. Furthermore, the court finds Mark Patterson guilty of fraudulent misrepresentation and recommends prosecution under state and federal statutes. Crestwood Development is ordered to pay restitution for damages and legal costs, and the matter will be referred to regulatory authorities for further investigation. I heard whispers ripple through the courtroom. Crestwood's lawyers shifted in their seats, their polished confidence dimmed. They had lost, and they knew it. Daniel leaned close to me, his voice a low whisper. You did it, Teresa. You stood your ground. But my eyes stayed on the judge as he concluded. This ruling should serve as a reminder. Land is not simply dirt to be bought and sold. It carries the weight of history, family, and trust. When that trust is broken, the law will not ignore it. The gavel struck, and the sound echoed like thunder rolling across empty plains. The case was closed. When we filed out of the courtroom, reporters crowded near the steps, their microphones thrust forward, their voices urgent. Mrs. Collins, how do you feel about regaining your property? Do you have anything to say to your daughter? What message do you want to send to Crestwood? I paused, the cameras flashing, Rachel standing just behind me. For years, my voice had been the quietest in the room, but now it carried. I spoke slowly, letting the words fall where they needed to. I want people to understand that silence is not weakness. Justice takes time, but it comes. This land was not just mine. It was my family's, my husband's, my daughter's legacy. You cannot erase love with a forged signature, and you cannot bury truth under concrete. I did not wait for their follow-up questions. I walked past the crowd, Rachel trailing in my shadow. Outside, the sky was bright, the air crisp. I felt taller somehow, though my body was as frail as ever. Rachel touched my arm gently as we reached the bottom step. "Mom," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I'm so sorry." I looked at her, seeing both the daughter who betrayed me and the daughter who still longed for forgiveness. "The court restored the land," I said softly. "But only you can restore your integrity. That choice is yours." Her tears spilled freely, but for once, I didn't reach to wipe them away. Some lessons must be lived, not soothed. That evening, back at my house, I placed the stamped judgment beside Paul's letter. I poured coffee into the blue cup and raised it toward the window where the ranch stretched in the distance. "We won, Paul," I whispered, not through vengeance, but through truth. The house felt lighter. The silence no longer pressed on me. It held me. Justice had been spoken aloud, and I had lived to hear it. The weeks after the judgment moved with a quiet rhythm, like the slow return of spring after a hard winter. For the first time in years, I woke without dread pressing on my chest. The ranch was mine again, legally, securely, and yet, more than land had been restored. A piece of my own dignity had returned to me. I drove back to the ranch one morning, the sky pale and wide, the mountains clear in the distance. The gate swung open without resistance, and the gravel road stretched out before me like an old friend waiting to be greeted. Survey stakes still pierced the ground, but their ribbons were fading now, sun-bleached and fraying in the wind. Soon, they would be gone, and the land would breathe again. I parked by the oak tree, carrying Paul's blue cup with me. I filled it with fresh water and set it at the roots, like an offering. My hand rested against the bark, rough and steady, as memories washed over me. Paul reading the newspaper in his chair, Rachel chasing fireflies, my own laughter carried on the evening air. For a moment, the years folded, and I was young again, my family whole. The silence held no accusation now. Instead, it felt like acceptance. The land had endured, and so had I. Rachel came, later that afternoon. I saw her car approaching slowly, cautiously, as though she were unsure if she had the right to return. She stepped out, dressed simply, her face bare of makeup. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if carrying shame had carved away her bravado. "Mom," she said softly, "can I walk with you?" I nodded, and we wandered toward the pasture. The grass swayed gently, the air full of the earthy smell of soil and hay. She spoke hesitantly, her voice breaking at times. "I don't know how to make things right. I can't undo what I did, but I want to learn, if you'll let me." I listened, the words settling between us like seeds. For the first time, I didn't rush to answer. Silence stretched, and she grew restless, glancing at me. Finally, I said, "Rachel, forgiveness is not a gift I hand you in one moment. It's a path we walk, step by step, and you must do the walking." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Then I'll walk." We stopped at the fence line, looking out over the wide field. For a long time, we said nothing more. The land itself seemed to speak for us, reminding us that healing is never sudden. It grows slowly, like grass pushing through hard earth. That night, I returned home and set the court papers aside. I placed Paul's ring back into its small box, not because I was letting him go, but because I was ready to carry him differently, less as a wound, more as a quiet strength. The blue cup stayed on the table, always within reach, a reminder of resilience. Neighbors came by in the following days. Some brought pies, others offered handshakes. They spoke of the news, of Crestwood's collapse, of Mark's arrest. But I guided the conversations back to ordinary things: the weather, the church fair, the school board election. I wanted life to feel simple again, stitched together by ordinary threads. Daniel visited one evening, bringing a bottle of wine. "To victory," he said with a smile, raising his glass. "To truth," I corrected gently, and we clinked glasses. He studied me for a moment. "What will you do with the ranch now?" I looked out the window, where the horizon stretched wide and waiting. I'll keep it, but not to cling to the past. I'll keep it so the land stays whole. I may even donate part of it to a nature preserve, so others can find peace there. Paul would have liked that. Daniel nodded, his smile thoughtful. That sounds exactly right. Later that night, after he left, I sat on the porch and watched the stars rise. The air was cool, the night alive with crickets. I thought of the journey: betrayal, silence, revelation, justice. The pain had been real, but so was the healing. I spoke into the night as though Paul could hear me. We carried the truth long enough. Now it can carry us. Rachel still had her path to walk. Mark had his consequences to face. Crestwood had its reckoning to endure. But I had my peace. Not perfect, not whole, but enough. As the stars deepened, I whispered the line that had carried me all along, the echo of Paul's wisdom, the truth etched in my heart. Roots hold even when branches break. And with that, I closed my eyes, letting the quiet wrap around me. Not as loneliness, but as home. The morning light spilled across my kitchen table, soft and golden, touching the blue cup that had followed me through every storm. I sat there quietly, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock. Life, after so much upheaval, had settled into something gentler. Yet it was not finality I felt. It was possibility. The ranch was mine again, yes. The court had spoken, the land restored, the truth acknowledged. But what happens after victory? No one tells you that the silence after a gavel strike is just as daunting as the silence before it. It asks a new question. What will you do now? I carried that question with me as I returned to the ranch each day. The oak tree stood as it always had, sturdy, patient, its roots deep enough to survive any storm. I walked the fields, touching the soil with my hands, remembering Paul's voice telling me that land never truly belongs to us. We belong to it. Those words echoed now, urging me not to guard the ranch like a relic, but to let it breathe into the future. Rachel came sometimes, timid and quiet, her steps careful, as if the ground might reject her. She didn't ask for forgiveness anymore. Instead, she listened. She listened to the way the wind moved through the grass, to the way I spoke of Paul's dreams, to the silence that held us when words failed. For the first time in years, I saw in her a willingness not to control, but to learn. Whether that would be enough, only time could tell. Mark's fate unfolded far from me. I heard whispers, court dates, plea deals, the slow unraveling of a man who built his future on fraud. I did not rejoice in his downfall. I simply acknowledged it, the way one acknowledges rain falling on land that cannot drink anymore. His choices had led him there, and my part in that story had ended. As for Crestwood, their empire cracked. Investigations spread wider than the ranch. Other families came forward with stories, some too painful to tell without trembling. I realized then that my fight had not been only mine. It had opened doors for others to step into light. Perhaps that was the truest justice of all. One evening, I stood on the porch with Daniel. We watched the horizon together, the land stretching out under the soft glow of dusk. He asked me, "What's next for you, Teresa?" I thought of the many answers I could give. Sell part of the land, donate it to a preserve, teach children again about the history of soil and roots. Or maybe simply live quietly, waking with the sun, tending to the earth, drinking coffee from the blue cup. I don't know, I said finally, smiling a little. But maybe not knowing is the gift. For once, I get to choose, without fear, without pressure. Just choose. Daniel nodded. That sounds like freedom. As the stars began to appear, I held Paul's ring in my hand. I would always carry him, but the grief that once bent my shoulders no longer crushed me. Instead, it steadied me, like a root anchoring me even as branches stretched toward new skies. The story was not tied in a perfect bow. Rachel still had miles of forgiveness to walk. The ranch still bore scars of survey stakes and broken trust. My own heart still carried bruises that time alone would not heal. But life does not end with perfection. It continues with endurance. I lifted the blue cup to my lips, the coffee warm, the night cool, and I whispered to myself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning of whatever comes next." And in that moment, I knew the open spaces of my life, like the open fields of the ranch, were waiting to be filled with new choices, new voices, new hope. The ending was not closure. It was an opening,